My name is Lucy Aplin and I'm a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behaviour. I gave an earlier lecture in this series on culture in birds, and I'm back to talk about the implications of animal culture for ecology and evolution. So there's been a lot of interest in studying animal culture as a way of understanding the evolution of culture and the capacity for culture, both in animals and in humans. And you've heard some perspectives on this in recent lectures. But I'm a behavioural ecologist. I'm interested in understanding the way in which animals acquire, process and use information, and what consequences this has for their life history and the way in which they live in their environments. So in this framework, why does animal culture matter? Well, it's the potential ecological and evolutionary implications that are really exciting, because culture allows a non-heritable learned behaviour to become heritable, while letting it be shaped over time by feedbacks within and between individuals and between individuals in the population. This feedback might allow populations to develop learned behavioural adaptations for specific local conditions. If cultural variation leads to reproductive isolation between populations, then there's also the potential for culture to become a player in forming new species. And if cultural repertoire affects individual fitness, then there's the potential for culture to influence the direction of genetic evolution more broadly. Excited? Good. So this is a really broad topic and I can't cover everything, but I'm going to try and go through a diverse array of subjects. And as always, there's references at the bottom of the slides that you can follow up on, as well as at the end of the talk. So this is going to be a lecture of 4 parts. First, we're going to start with the fundamental question, is culture adaptive? Where they're going to look in more detail at the link between the ecology and how it might influence the expression and development of culture. Third, we're going to turn our attention to changing environments, asking about the diffusion of new innovations and how existing cultures might cope with this change. And finally, we're going to turn our attention to co-evolutionary dynamics, asking how culture can affect the direction of genetic evolution. So I'm aware that some of you, or most of you, aren't behavioural ecologists. So here are some basic definitions to keep in mind as we go through this lecture. First, the key basis of Darwinian evolution is the idea of variation between individuals, selection on that variation, and inheritance of this selected variation. And when we talk about an individual's fitness, we're referring to its contribution to this outcome, to the gene pool of the next generation. When I talk about adaptations, I'm referring to evolved solutions to environmental problems that affect fitness, so of survival and reproduction. And more specifically in this context, when I talk about adaptive behaviours, I'm talking about behaviours that contribute to an individual's fitness and are thus subject to the forces of natural selection. And 2 final things to keep in mind here are firstly that these can all refer to cultural traits or to traits with a genetic basis, and that we measure selection and variation at the individual level because this is the unit at which these processes operate. Previous lectures have established that social learning is widespread across different ecological contexts and in different species, and you've been given examples ranging from tool use in chimpanzees to migration routes in fish. All of these contexts have the clear potential to be very important for the life history of the animals involved, influencing their survival and their reproductive success. For example, learning about how to correctly process scorpions is clearly vital for the survival of a meerkat pup, and assisting the pup to learn about scorpions also improves the reproductive fitness of its parents. However, as you've also heard in previous lectures, social learning is not always adaptive. The best quality information is that which you've sourced for yourself. If it's second-hand from others, it could be inappropriate for your circumstances, it could be out of date, or you may not even receive it if you don't know the right individuals. Rather, whether a species has evolved to use social learning, will depend on the opportunity for learning and the trade-off between the costs and benefits of learning versus genetically fixed behaviour, and of social learning versus individual learning. This balance will depend on multiple factors. I've listed some of them here, but in addition to this, as explored by Professor Kendall in the lecture on social learning strategies, using social learning strategically can help tip this balance in favour of social information. For example, in point 4 here, social information might more often outperform personal information if you choose to copy experienced older individuals who are already clearly successful. However, in general, I think we can clearly say that a long history of theoretical and empirical research has shown us that the use of social learning is under selection and is shaped by evolution. And as social learning is the building block of culture, if social learning is adaptive, it follows that culture should most often tend to be locally adaptive as well. You might be able to spot some exceptions to this. For example, when there's a conflict between the need to be the same as others in your group and the best behaviour to suit the environment, or when the environment has changed very rapidly and culture hasn't kept pace. And we'll get to these more in depth later in the lecture. But in general, what evidence do we have that cultural behaviour in animals is locally adaptive and has important fitness consequences for individuals? Well, there's actually surprisingly few empirical examples, perhaps partly because previous methods for identifying cultural variation have emphasised excluding clear environmental explanations for behaviour. But we do have some few good examples which at least each partly show part of the picture. So the first I'll give you occurs in black rats. In recent years, black rats have followed humans across the globe. Their original habitat is actually in the tropical lowland forests of Southeast Asia. In Israel, black rats have, since the 1980s, been observed occupying a new habitat, the Jerusalem pine forests. The occupation of this niche seems to have been driven by the removal of native forests and facilitated by the lack of squirrels as competition in these areas. So it was first observed by Ran Ashner and Joseph Turkel that black rats were in these forests and that they were showing unusual behaviour for rats. They were nesting up in the trees rather than on the ground, and they were feeding on seeds extracted from pine cones. And this started an investigation of almost 2 decades with a series of studies looking at the acquisition or ontogeny of pine cone stripping behaviour. Here's a diagram of how the rats eat the pine cones. They start from the base and chew off the scales in a spiral fashion, moving up the cone, removing seeds one at a time. And experiments have shown that you need to follow this sort of behavioural pattern in order to recover more energy from eating pine seeds than you lose in actually processing it. So a series of laboratory studies showed that very few black rats caught from urban areas were able to spontaneously show this behaviour even after 3 months of exposure to the pine cones. They were also unable to acquire it through social learning. However, pups raised by knowledgeable mothers acquired the behaviour, and cross-fostering showed that this wasn't due to genetic similarity, but rather it was being culturally transmitted from mother to pup. In particular, the opportunity for pups to have contact with partly stripped cones appeared to be vital. Importantly, pine seeds appear to be the main source of the rats, main source of food to the rats in these forests, and they become specialist on this resource. Given the research suggests that the behaviour of how to exploit pine cones is culturally inherited, we probably here have the best candidate for local adaptation by a culture where this has facilitated habitat persistence and colonisation. What we don't know is how it all started, unlike in our next example from humpback whales. So you were already given this example of lobtail feeding in a previous lecture by Professor Renhill. To remind you, humpbacks show this bubble net feeding behaviour where they circle the school in bubbles and then they lunge through the middle to capture the prey. Off the coast of Maine in 1979, whale watchers first observed an extra step of this behaviour, where the whales slapped their tail down on top of the school before lunging, which apparently seems to stun the fish. So 3 pieces of evidence suggest there's a role for ecological factors in the emergence and uptake of what is shown to be a culturally transmitted behaviour. First, the frequency of observations of lobtail feeding over time suggests that at least at first its emergence was matched to sand lance abundance. So if we look down here on the bottom right, then in the black we see, in the green we see the abundance of sand lance fluctuating over time, and in black we see the emergence and uptake of the lobtail behaviour, and it very closely matches, at least at first, the abundance of this resource. Secondly, the author suggests that because it's clustered in the areas in which sand lance spawn, it could well be a specialisation to this particular prey type. And finally, in the years immediately preceding the lobtail feeding emergence, the stock of herring, which is another important prey species for humpbacks, had crashed. So while this adds a temporal dimension missing from the black-rack example, this is indirect evidence drawn from correlations between temporal and spatial frequencies of prey and behaviour, that there's a link between ecology and culture here. Our final case study might give the last piece of the puzzle with a link between individual fitness and culture. So the population of dolphins in Shark Bay off Western Australia is well known to use these sponge tools. Individuals hold sponges at the end of their nose and use them when they're foraging through the sand looking for benthic animals, and it seems to be that the sponges prevent irritation to their skin. A series of studies have shown that this behaviour is culturally inherited. Most often it's vertically transmitted from mother to daughter. Indirect evidence that it's cultural also comes from its clustering in the social network. So most sponges occur in this section of the network here, and if we take that out and blow it up, then here the larger nodes are the sponge tool using dolphins, and you can see they cluster in sub-communities. There has been previous evidence that this behaviour is linked to ecological factors and has consequences for the animals. Sponging animals most often occur in areas with more available sponges, and fatty acid analysis of the dolphins shows that sponges have significantly different diets to non-sponges foraging in the same habitat, suggesting that they're accessing a different foraging niche. However, recent research has shown direct fitness consequences of this behaviour. So in 2011, the Shark Bay area suffered a terrible marine heat wave, which led to major loss of seagrass and a mass mortality of fish. While all of the dolphins suffered from this effect, both with decreased reproductive success and decreased survival, tool-using dolphins appeared to have been partly buffered. So there was a 12% decline in dolphins which didn't use tools compared to an only 6% decline in those that did. Presumably this was because these dolphins had access to an additional foraging niche that they could fall back on. This natural experiment reveals a direct fitness consequence of cultural behaviour, where the cultural animals, or the animals which had this cultural trait, had a higher survival. And we can speculate how, over time, selection could then lead, if these sorts of environmental shocks continue, it could lead to animals which are more likely to use social learning and acquire cultural traits, becoming more frequent in the population. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of the lecture, where we're going to look more explicitly at how the ecology can shape and influence culture in animal populations. First is the necessity hypothesis, and you probably all heard colloquial versions of this idea. For example, necessity is the mother of invention. More formally, it suggests that the innovation, transmission and retention of culture all requires extensive investment by individuals and should only be undertaken in response to a need. This has been developed from observations of tool use, which is often very difficult and costly to learn and perform. For example, the physical effort involved in using stone tools by capuchin monkeys must be immense. The opportunity and free time hypotheses, by contrast, have their origins in observations that some species are much more innovative when pressures are removed. Most famously, the orangutans that you can see here, using a saw to cut wood. So the free time hypothesis suggests that innovation and culture can develop when the pressures of starvation and predation are removed, like in captivity, while the opportunity hypothesis suggests that encounter rates with materials and resources whose exploitation requires tools or new solutions will affect the likelihood of the invention and spread of this culture. We have evidence for both of these hypotheses, and I also want to emphasize that they're non-mutually exclusive but could work together. For example, if you think back to the earlier case study of lobtail feeding in humpback whales, the evidence indirectly suggests that this has emerged in response to a crash in herring stocks, which would be an ecological necessity, but has also allowed the better exploitation of an ecological opportunity, the spawning sandlands. So a recent review has summarized the evidence, a weight of evidence for both the opportunity and necessity hypotheses in these three species, the orangutan, the chimpanzee and the capuchin monkey. So if we just take the example of the capuchin monkey, the authors compared at a site in Boa Vista the link between various aspects of the ecology and tool use rate. So here you see the availability of nuts that they crack open with tools over the course of the year and the tool use rate, and there's a very clear match. Also how terrestrial the animals were compared to the rate of tool use. And then on these two we see the availability of two alternative foods, fruit and insects that don't require tools. And these two graphs actually show no correlation, and the authors suggest that the conclusion from these studies is that opportunity and not necessity is the main driver of the occurrence of tool use to access nuts. They also suggest that the resources extracted using tools, nuts or honey or termites, are often among the nutritionally richest in the habitat, and so the extraction is paying off as a bonus and is not a response to general food scarcity. The authors also use these results to propose a more general three-factor model of material culture, and this links cognition and sociality to ecological opportunity with the invention, transmission and retention of behaviour. So now let's move on to the third part of our lecture, where we're going to consider what happens to culture in changing environments. For many animals, the environments they live in no longer resemble those that we might think they evolved in, but rather have been modified by the actions of humans and are rapidly changing. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the process of urbanization, which replaces environments with entirely new habitats, which are full of both ecological challenges and opportunities. And unfortunately, as we all know, many animals have found this a challenge too far and are highly threatened by the process of habitat modification. However, some species show the opposite response, exhibiting behavioural adaptations to these new environments, even expanding their populations and ranges. For example, these great tits naturally nest in tree hollows, like that would be found in this environment that they would usually occupy or naturally occupy. But they've been very successful at colonizing urban environments where they take advantage of alternative nesting sites as well. Research comparing urban colonization success between different species has told us that cognition and innovativeness is associated with this success. But as we've heard in my previous lecture and throughout this series, innovations may be very important for an individual's own success, but they live and die with that single individual unless they're transmitted socially. So the diffusion of innovation and the establishment of new cultural traits could potentially lead to the collective pooling of knowledge and impact the success of whole populations in these new environments. The most famous of these diffusions of innovations has been mentioned several times throughout this lecture series, the milk bottle opening innovation in tits, where birds learn to pierce the tops of milk bottles and exploit this new resource that was provided on suburban doorsteps across Britain. This behaviour spread geographically and accelerated through the population over the course of 2 decades until they confronted a change in the resource that they couldn't innovate a solution to, the change to plastic-topped milk bottles. The social transmission of innovation through the population resulting in culture could potentially enable populations to exhibit rapid behavioural responses to new opportunities. And it might be a vital mechanism by which animal populations can adapt to human-induced environmental change. The diffusion of innovations can also potentially lead to population-level niche shifts, ultimately with ecological or evolutionary consequences. And we would predict that there might be a whole series of factors which affect the likelihood of the step from one to the next of these sort of components of this pathway. But no study in the wild has convincingly described this all the way from a new environment through to a population level niche shift. Some have come close. For example, the milk bottle innovation gives us part of the pathway, and we've also able to replicate this central part of this pathway through cultural diffusion experiments. I'm going to tell you about a couple of these experiments, both of which use this study species that I've referred to, the great hare. In the population I worked in, we microchip all the birds with these little electronic tags which register in contact with antenna, and we can put these antenna on feeders or on interactive puzzles and do experiments with them this way. Allows us to really increase our sample size. So what do we know about this species? Well, they actually appear to be extremely innovative, both the milk bottle innovation, but many others give us evidence for this in the wild. And they also have a lifestyle that we associate with these foraging innovations, a generalist diet and social foraging behaviour. This innovativeness has also been subject to study by Dr. Cole and colleagues, who gave birds different problems they had to solve and asked what their propensity to solve them was. So here we have a lever they have to pull out and the platform drops through, and here the food is at the end of a string and the bird has to work out how to pull it up. And when these problem-solving tasks were given to birds, it was found that there was variation in whether birds could solve them, and this variation was quite repeatable. So individuals, if they could solve one of these, tended to also be able to solve the other. So who were these innovative individuals? Well, they often were juveniles, as shown in the bar plot down here, and they were also tending to be less competitive individuals, which gives us a little bit of a hint towards that ecological hypothesis that I suggested before, that in this case perhaps necessity is driving innovation. Those individuals in a less fortunate position, they're less competitive, they're young, they're subdominant, are those that are coming up with the innovations. We can also then look at how these innovations transmit across populations, and I've done this in a series of cultural diffusion experiments where I train birds in captivity to become an innovator of this foraging puzzle, here pushing a door to the left or right to get food, and then release them back into the wild and watch this behaviour spread through the population. In this case, we have a bidirectional door, so the birds can solve it by pushing right, but they could equally solve it by pushing left, and the innovator is only trained on one of those two options. And what we see is that the innovations spread through the populations. Here the experimental sites are those in the blue and red, and the control is in green. In the experimental sites, the behaviour spreads through the population with these classic diffusion curves, which resemble those that we see for the spread of technology in humans. And the vast majority of expressions of the behaviour match the variant that I introduced with the innovator, giving us good evidence that it's socially learned. It also persists over multiple generations, and so really forms a tradition for, in this case, either left or right. Finally, we can track its movement through the social network. So here, the innovator birds are in yellow, and the birds are turning red in the order in which they learned. And hopefully what's obvious is that the behaviour is spreading through the social network, following the pathway of social network ties. And this social network approach allows us to ask whether individuals are more or less likely to learn given their social opportunity to do so. And when we look at that, again, we find that age is very important, with the younger individuals, those that are faster to socially acquire this trait. But in addition, we can also show that this move from an innovation to a group level change in behaviour is influenced by social factors, for example, social networks, and developmental and cognitive factors, for example, the age of the individual's learning. So that gives you an example of this part of the pathway. Do we have any evidence for real ecological or evolutionary consequences of the diffusion of innovations? Well, this is much harder to say. Perhaps the best example is that one I gave you earlier on of black rats, where there does appear to be a real ecological consequence of this culturally inherited behaviour. I want to give you another final example though, because I think this one's really interesting in that it shows that these ecological consequences might just not be for the species involved, but also for the community of species around them. So this is of the kelp gull and right whale interaction in Argentina.
Right whales visiting Peninsula Valdez face a unique and increasing threat from an unexpected source and a native species, kelp gulls.
Kelp gulls have learned to feed on the skin and blubber of right whales at Peninsula Valdez. The gulls land on the back of the whales and they peck on open wounds and they feed on the blubber. And this is very painful to the whales. And the attacks can go on for hours at a time. So the quality of life of right whales at Peninsula Valdez has been seriously affected by gull harassment.
Here you can see a proxy for this increase, which is the number of lesions on the back. So lesions are caused by this behaviour on the back of whales in this area, and also the percentage of whales that are seen with lesions. And you can see that over a decade there's an exponential increase in the incidence of this behaviour, suggesting that it's a diffusion of innovation on the part of the gulls. This appears, as you saw in that video, to have a real detrimental effect for the whales. And what's really interesting is that this has led to the emergence of behaviour on the part of them as well. So there appears to have been a new posture developed by the whales to protect themselves from the gulls. It's called oblique breathing, where the whales emerge only with the heads out of the water to avoid most of the back being exposed. And researchers that were studying this behaviour showed that it emerged in this part of the Gulf, so you see the pecking by gulls in this whole peninsula area, and showed a 5-fold increase in occurrence between 2010 and 2012, and again between 2012 and 2013. and within each year its spatial and temporal occurrence matched the rate of the attack by the gulls. But towards the end of the observation period, whales appeared to be performing it with all surfacing. So the authors suggested that the diffusion of innovation on the part of the gulls led to a resulting or a matched diffusion of innovation on the part of the whales, with this new behaviour spreading, leading to an establishment stage when the whales were actually performing it in a preventative manner, even when the gulls weren't present. They also suggest that oblique breathing is likely to pose extra energy costs, so the increasing prevalence of this behaviour suggests that it seems to be a really useful strategy to prevent harassment by gulls. What I think is so fascinating about this example is it shows you that the effect of behavioural traits in one species can carry over to the larger ecological community and lead to the diffusion of other cultural traits in other species. And potentially, maybe here we even have a cultural arms race going on that might develop further in the future. Okay, so thus far I've given you lots of evidence that culture can act as a buffer. It can enable flexibility to changes in the environment by allowing individuals to exploit new niches without any need for selection on genetic traits. And as we've seen, the diffusion of innovation can potentially spread and establish information on rapid timescales within single generations, or even in a few generations. And this can give the opportunity for species to invade new environments or to persist in changed environments and better deal with environmental shocks. For example, dolphins have learned to use sponge tools to access new resource, and they have a higher survival rate if they do so after an environmental shock, while cultural inheritance potentially allows black rats to occupy new habitat that their morphology is not necessarily well adapted for. But other authors have argued that culture might lead to an effect of inertia or even a trap under conditions of environmental change. So this harks back to right at the beginning of the lecture, where I talked about theoretical modelling that suggests that social learning can lead to out-of-date information unless you have ongoing individual sampling at the same time. And this effect of a trap might be especially the case if individuals are following the majority behaviour or trying to match the majority. So first I'm going to give you two examples of cultural inertia and suboptimal traditions, and then I'm going to talk about an experiment I did to look at the potential mechanisms underlying this process. So the first example I want to give you is in guppies. So in this study, Leyland and colleagues trained guppies to follow a route through a maze to get to a food source. And they did this training on two types of individuals, on individuals that were shown how to get to the route, go through a short route, and those that were trained on a longer route, so a more inefficient route to the food. They then put these individuals into groups and basically founded new cultural traditions in these groups and looked at the behaviour over time along with turnover in the groups. And what they found was that initially the groups stuck to the trained route, and over time groups that had had the short route introduced were very faithful to this choice. And this is in real contrast to groups that were given a longer route, where this behaviour eroded over time as they moved towards a more efficient option. But what we can see is that even though they did move to a more efficient option, this took time, so you had this sort of cultural lag of this inefficient information. The second example I want to give you is that of translocation experiments in wild blue-headed wrasse. So this is a blue-headed wrasse male at a spawning site with multiple females, who are the yellow ones here. And blue-headed wrasse live on coral reefs, and they have these communal spawning sites. Spawning sites are very predictable, so they're these coral protuberances that are on the edge of the coral reef and with a current that will take the eggs out to the open ocean. However, populations at reefs tend to only use a subset of the possible available sites. And they stick to these sites over many years. So in the 1980s, Warner did an experiment where he swapped populations between reefs. So he would catch the entire population of one reef and move it to another at the same time, removing the entire population of that site. So they're starting fresh. And what he found is that in this translocation, they didn't pick the same subset of sites that were used by the original population, but established their own set of spawning sites. And this led him to suggest that spawning sites were a tradition maintained over many years, and that new populations started new traditions. In a follow-up study, he swapped sites again. So sites were either left for a very long time undisturbed, or after this initial translocation, those fish were removed and new fish were again placed in those same spots. And what he found was that in these circumstances, they tended to pick the same subset of sites that had been picked by the individuals who'd just been there recently. So here we can see one reef with its subset of its list of potential mating sites that he identified, and the subset of those sites that had been chosen by the original population, and that this was consistent over time. Then the first translocated group picked a different subset of sites, but the second translocated group also picked the same subset of sites that the first group had picked. He suggested that what was actually happening here was resource assessment. So these two groups of new individuals were coming to basically the same conclusions over what was the best site. And what's interesting is that this isn't what the original population was using. His explanation for this was that that original population had originally picked the best sites a long time ago, but then maintained these through cultural transmission and the formation of traditions, and that gradual changes in the environment had meant that these were no longer the best sites. He proposed some circumstances where it might be difficult for traditions to keep up with environmental conditions, like what may have happened here. He suggested that first, it could be when the environment changes very slowly. Second, when the costs of not changing are relatively small, like maybe the other sites are a bit better, but they're not that much better that it matters a lot. And third, excuse me, and third, when there's a high cost of initiating a change. In this case, if you go and start a new spawning site and nobody follows you, then your mating success is not going to be very good. Most controversially, he suggested that perhaps there's, in some cases, a benefit to catastrophic disturbances because they press the reset button on these traditions. So the final example I want to give you is the study I did in Great Tits, which was a follow-up to the previous one I showed you, looking at what happens when the environment changes again. So I gave them the sliding door task that they had already been exposed to, but I made it so that one side of the door gave a low reward and the other side of the door gave you a higher reward, mealworms, as you can see here. And when I created these unequal payoffs, I found that only after just 3 weeks of exposure, half the population had already switched their preference to the high payoff behaviour, even though previous to this, the traditions had been extremely stable over time and over generations. So what was the mechanism that was underlying it? Well, my colleagues and I did a sequential learning model to look at this, where we asked what the personal experience of a bird coming to get to use this foraging resource was, so what did it do it in the past, and what had it had the opportunity to just observe other individuals doing. We found that actually the birds remained very conformist, so they were disproportionately likely to adopt the majority behaviour in their groups, even when the majority was doing a lower payoff behaviour. However, their personal experience was very payoff biased, so if they had the chance to personally experience the higher payoff in the past, they were very likely to perform this behaviour again. These birds are very fission-fusion, so groups are remixing and mixing up all the time. And so occasionally birds would be in groups where the majority was performing the rare behaviour, and they'd have the opportunity to personally experience it. Once this had happened, they were very likely to switch, and as groups then continued to remix, this behaviour spread through the population, initially very slowly, but over time speeding up in a snowball effect. Another interesting result we found here was that there was again an effect of age. So at the end of the experiment, those individuals that had made the switch were much more likely to be young, as the younger individuals were more able to flexibly incorporate new behaviour into their repertoire. And this it adds the intriguing suggestion that populations could be more or less flexible depending on their age structure. In general, these results support the suggestion by Professor Galef that maladaptive information is unlikely to be transmitted or expressed because both the learner and the demonstrator will rapidly adjust their own behaviour to match what the best outcome is. However, also qualifies this idea where it might be the case that individual variation or social variation affect the ability of individuals to make this adjustment. So for most of this lecture, I've been talking about the link between culture and ecology. I've shown you how culture can be a source of locally adapted behaviour arising from ecological opportunities and ecological necessity. I've also talked about how culture can potentially influence how populations respond to changing environments through the diffusion of beneficial innovations, and how existing cultures can buffer individuals to environmental change or change themselves in response to changes in the environment. So for the last part of this lecture, I want to quickly turn to the evolutionary implications of this for species. Now, I'm not going to go into depth here because the next lecture will look at more fundamentally how culture and evolutionary biology interact and may change the way we think about evolution. But what I will do is look at how and where culture might shape evolutionary ecology. So what we're referring to here is what's often called gene-culture coevolution. And this has almost been exclusively considered in humans, so this is very recent research. In a recent opinion piece by Hal Whitehead and colleagues, they argued that it may well be possible in animals that cultural behaviour could select for particular functional genes, influence patterns of genetic diversity, and spark speciation. They also suggested that when cultural activity is an important determinant of fitness, it could generate selection for traits that further enhance culture, allowing them to evolve in a reciprocal fashion. This sort of process is better understood and more accepted in humans, and a classic example of cultural behaviour leading to selection on functional genes is that of lactose tolerance, where a genetic mutation to digest lactose into adulthood was associated with the rise of dairy farming and encouraged the spread of both this mutation and of dairy farming in some populations around the world. But in animals, the clearest example, we don't have many, would come probably from killer whales. Killer whales as a species have a very diverse diet, ranging from small fish to the largest whales. But each killer whale is typically the member of an ecotype, and ecotypes are actually very specialized in what they eat. In the best studied killer whale ecotypes, there's evidence that different matrilineal social units have different ways of life and specialize on different prey. And these specializations are almost certainly socially learned with vertical transmission from mother to offspring. As these become more efficient through cultural selection, they'll also become more specialist. And in concordance with this scenario, genomic studies have indicated that ecotypes started with small populations of related individuals. We also have reproductive isolation between ecotypes driven by vocal cultures, which are also socially learned and prevent individuals dispersing and mating with different ecotypes. And this leads over time to them becoming more genetically diverse. Finally, we have some recent evidence from genomic studies that culture could affect functional specific genes. The comparison between the fish-eating, resident, male-eating transient ecotypes of the North Pacific have found a signature consistent with selection on genes associated with digestion. And it was hypothesized that the more sporadic intake of large amounts of protein by mammal-eating killer whales may exert different selective pressures to the regular small amounts of protein eaten by the fish-eating killer whale ecotype. And so as the diet is socially learned, like the example of lactose tolerance in humans, this signature of selection on digestion supports the notion that the genes and culture are evolving in tandem. We also have evidence that bird song can influence speciation. So in my previous lecture on culture in birds, I showed you how bird songs are these long, complex vocalizations produced typically by male passerines in the breeding season to defend territories and attract mates. Birdsong is incredibly well studied, and we know that male passerines learn their song from adult male tutors, such as their father or their neighbours, and then selectively cull these songs later in life to reflect the songs in their local social environment. And this leads to the patterning of song dialects, with dialects potentially retained over a long period of time. I also showed you that we have evidence that song can be subject to cultural evolution, for example, going through bottlenecks in the process of island colonization. And finally, we have evidence from some species that females prefer males that sound like their father, a process we call assortative mating, and it's been argued that this reproductive isolation could lead to speciation because different populations with different dialects become more and more genetically different over time if individuals refuse to mate with individuals that have a different song type. But there's a lot of debate as to how important this is across different taxa. At the broad scale, work by Mason and colleagues showed that song learning increases rates of speciation across clades, for example with tanagers that learn their song, showing higher rates of speciation than woodcreepers where their song is innate. At the other end of the spectrum, we can look amongst a single species. In our old friend the white-crowned sparrow, which is an example I gave you in an earlier lecture, there's actually restricted gene flow between these different dialect groups that have different song types. And in neighbouring subspecies of the white-crowned sparrow, the strength of song discrimination correlates with genetic distance between sites, suggesting that the dialects are acting as a barrier to gene flow, and if this continues into the future, this could well lead to speciation. Finally, I want to talk to the third point in gene-culture coevolution and ask whether it's possible that culture could affect evolution more, the direction of evolution more broadly. So recently, Dr. Street and co-authors used a data set of almost 200 primate species to look at the evolutionary correlation between social learning and life history factors. And they found that the propensity for social learning, here in red on the left of this phylogenetic tree, correlates with brain size, with group size, and with longevity. And they conclude that their results are consistent with the hypothesis that the evolution of large brains, sociality, and long lifespans has promoted reliance on culture in primates, in turn driving further increases in brain volume, cognitive ability, and lifespan. This is recent research and it shows some fascinating potential trends in primates. However, we need much more understanding of these trends across broader animal lineages. And indeed, we're in the really early exploration stage for our understanding of the link between evolutionary ecology and culture. But it's going to be really exciting to see this, where this takes us over the next few years. So that brings us to the end of the lecture. This was a very fast move through the very broad links between the environment and culture and the evolutionary consequences of this. And in the upcoming lecture, you'll dive much deeper into this link between evolution and culture. And with that, I've added some useful reading, but you can also look in the bottom of the slides for references. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope you've enjoyed the lecture series to date and will enjoy the rest of the lectures as well. Goodbye.